All right, so the first thing we need to do is set up our project. So in the course files that are provided, there is a starter code zip folder. If you can go ahead and unzip that folder, and when you extract the content, you should have a starter code folder, and in that folder we should see an index.html page, a source folder with a lib and Kontra.js in it, and then an assets folder that has some images that we'll be using in our game. So the next thing we need to do is we actually need to open up our source code inside our editor. For this course, I will be using VS Code. You're welcome to follow along with another editor, but we'll be utilizing some of the features that are built into VS Code and some of the extensions in this course. So to go ahead and open up our source code, there's two different ways we can do this. The first is we can go up to File, and we can go ahead and go to Add Folder to Workspace, or we can go ahead and open our folder, and this will go ahead and open it up inside VS Code. The other option is you can right-click inside your workspace here and click on Add Folder to Workspace, and then go ahead and navigate to the starter code folder. So the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and set up our server for running our files. So for our game, we will be loading in images and loading them into our game, so we need to run our game on a local server. So there are various ways to do this, but one of the benefits of using VS Code is they have an extension marketplace where we can go ahead and add extensions to our editor, and one of these is a live server that will go ahead and run our code for us, and it will also watch for changes and automatically reload. So on the bar over here, if you go and click on this button here, this will go ahead and open up your extensions. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and search for live server. And what we should see is there should be live server by Ritwork Day. We want to go ahead and install that live server. All right, and so what that'll do is it's going to add this go live button down here, and it's going to show that our extension is installed. So one other thing I want to note for this course is I will have the Beautify extension installed, and what this extension allows you to do is it allows you to beautify your code. So basically it can help clean it up and make sure it meets standards. So it can beautify your JavaScript, your JSON, HTML, and CSS files. So all the files we'll be working with for this course, it can go ahead and beautify them for you. So just to kind of see an example of what it can do is let me go ahead and go into my index.html page here. And if we go ahead and open up our command palette, so one way to do that is if you go up to View, there's Command Palette. So if you do Beautify File, what it'll do is it'll take your current file and it'll go ahead and beautify it for you. So you can see it went ahead and formatted the file for me automatically. All right, so to go ahead and test our go live, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and click on this button down here, and we can go ahead and choose our folders. We're going to go ahead and do starter code. And then what you should go ahead and do is start your server and go ahead and in your default browser, it should go ahead and open up the index.html page. So what we should see is we'll see match 3 at the top. So if we right click and go ahead and go into our inspector, we'll see we have our meta tag and our title tag. And if we go ahead and switch to our console, we'll see we have live reload enabled. So this is where one of the big benefits of using this extension is anytime we make a change to our file, it'll be automatically reflected over in our browser. All right, and so what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to go ahead and just kind of bring my browser over into my code editor so we can go ahead and view both at the same time. So let me go ahead and just shrink this down a little bit so we can see both. So to go ahead and test, I'm just going to go ahead and add a paragraph tag. So I'm just going to do hello world. If we save, we'll see our browser automatically refreshes and we have our new text. All right, so now that we have our project set up, we can go ahead and get started working on our code. All right, so the first thing we need to do is let's go to the top of our body tag, and we need to go ahead and load in our Kontra library. So to do that, we'll go ahead and add our script tag. Let's go ahead and add the source attribute, and we're going to go ahead and do source/lib/contramin.js. And we'll go ahead and save. The next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a file to go ahead and store our JavaScript code that we'll be writing. So inside our source folder, let's go ahead and add a new file, and we're just going to call this main.js. Then what we can do is let's come back to our index.html page, and let's go ahead and add a script tag with a source, and we'll go do source, and we will do our main.js file. So for this course, we'll be using JavaScript modules. And so the benefits of using modules are we can go ahead and create code in one file and export it out. And import that in another file without having to explicitly go into our HTML page and load in all these resources when our page first starts up. Instead, our browser is going to detect that it's a module and it's going to load the code we need when it needs it. So one of the benefits of using modules is we can go ahead in one of our JavaScript files, we can export out a piece of code, and then in another file we can import it. And one of the main reasons why this is different is before, when we loaded it in our scripts inside our HTML page, a lot of our content would be global, and then that's how we would be able to access those variables and functions from one file from another. Instead, what the browser does is it detects that this is a module, and when it loads our module, it goes ahead and loads all of the applicable code for that module and keeps it together. So the best way to see how these work is to actually create an example. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and let's go ahead and make a new file. And I'm just going to go ahead and call this game.js. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create a variable. So I'm just going to do const test equals 1. So if I want to go ahead and use this test variable inside my main.js file, we need to go ahead and export it. So we're going to go ahead and use the export keyword, and we'll go ahead and save. So to go ahead and use this, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do import, we'll do curly braces, and we'll go ahead and do our test variable, and we'll go from, and we'll do single quote, and we'll go ahead and do our quotations, and we'll do ./game.js. And then what we can do is I can go do a console log. We'll go ahead and log test, and we'll go ahead and save. So what this line here does is import tells our browser that we want to load something from another file. This syntax here allows us to specify what it is we want to load, and then from is the keyword that will tell us which file we're loading from. So when we export our values, when we do it like this, then this value will be exported as an object. So what we're really saying is that we are exporting this object that has a property called test, and its value is set to our test variable. So when we load this in here, we're loading in an object, and we're only going to go ahead and grab the test property from that object. So the reason I bring this up is because when you export things, you can also do a thing where you can export out default values. And when you do this, then this will be the only thing that's available from the export. So if I go ahead and do export default 1, so if we come back to our main.js file, this will change our import statement because we're only exporting one thing, so we can name this anything we want. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it test since that's what we're referencing down here. And then whatever it is that we exported here will be stored inside this variable. So if we go ahead and take a look at our browser, what we'll see is we should see an error. And what we're seeing is a syntax error. Import declarations will only appear at the top level of a module. So what this is a browser warning for when you try to use modules without explicitly telling the browser that we're loading a module. So to do that, so to fix that, what we need to do is on our script here, we just need to add a type attribute, and we need to go ahead and set it to module. So now if we go ahead and save, you'll see over here in our console, we console log 1. So we can see that our code is working. So we can see that our default export is working, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and refer this back to just our export const, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back here. So we'll see that we have an error, import not found default. Yes, so the error that's happening here is when we do import and we just provide a name, this syntax is looking for a default export with the values that we want. So there's two ways we could resolve this. The first is we could do an export default statement, and we can go ahead and provide our object with our test property and our test value. We go ahead and save, and then over here you'll see when we import, because we have default, this now resolves on test, but instead of getting our value, we get our full object. The other way to solve this is we go ahead and get rid of that default export, and we can just go ahead and use our curly braces again to import just this property. Go ahead and save. You'll see that value is now provided. So to start building a game in Kontra, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to initialize our game. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use the global Kontra object that is available from the library. And so the global Kontra object has a variety of methods that we'll be using throughout our game. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and call init. So to do that, what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and go into main.js. Let's go ahead and remove the code we had here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do const. Let's go ahead and do object, and we'll do equal contra. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reference the init property from our object. And then so what we need to do is we need to go ahead and call this function. So when we call the init function, what it does is it goes ahead and returns an object to us. So what we'll do is we're going to do const. We'll go ahead and do our curly braces. We'll set equal to init. And inside our curly braces, what we'll do is we'll grab the canvas property, and we'll go ahead and grab the context property from this function. So if we go ahead and save, we should see right away over in our console, we should have an error. So t is null. So what's happening here is when we call the init function, Kontra under the hood is going to go ahead and look for an HTML canvas element and try to get our context from that canvas so that we can go ahead and draw on it. However, because we don't have a canvas object, this error is thrown. So to fix that, what we need to do is we need to come to our HTML page, and we need to go ahead and create that canvas element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our paragraph tags. I'm going to go ahead and add canvas, and I'm going to go ahead and add the width property. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 360, and we need to go ahead and add the height property. And I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to 640, and we'll go ahead and close it. So now when we save, our browser refreshes and we see that our error goes away. However, we can't really see anything on our page here, so it doesn't look like anything is actually happening. So what we'll do is we'll come back to our main.js file. Let's just go ahead and add a console log. Let's go ahead and log our canvas variable, and let's go ahead and log our context variable. And what we should see is we should have values inside these. So if we go ahead and make our console a little bit bigger, you'll see we have a reference to our canvas HTML element, and then we have our rendering context for our canvas element. So we can see that Kontra initialized correctly. So now we went ahead and initialized our Kontra game. The next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and create our game loop. So Kontra has a pretty basic game loop, and what that game loop consists of is two functions, an update and a render function. So the update function is used to actually update our game state. So this is where we update the game state for our various game objects. So if we want to do things like animate our game objects, so have it move across our screen, we could update its X value or Y values. And so this is where we could also check for things like collision. The other function, our render function, is used to actually render out our game state to the screen. So this is where all the drawing happens, where we use our context object to go ahead and draw to our screen, to our canvas element. So the render element is going to be used to constantly redraw our game objects, so that way it makes it look like they're moving across the screen. So to go ahead and create our game loop, the global Kontra object exposes a game loop property. And so when we call this function, it allows us to create our game loop. So what we'll do is up in our const here, we'll go ahead and add game loop. And then what we'll do down here is we're going to go ahead and create a new variable. We'll go ahead and call this loop. We'll set it equal to game loop. So game loop is expecting an object. And this object needs to have two properties. The first will be the update, and the second will be the render. And both these properties need to be functions that Kontra can call when these two states happen in our game loop. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just add our functions. And what we'll do is I'm just going to go ahead and add a console log, update. Go ahead and copy that. Go ahead and paste that in render. And we'll go ahead and save. So after we create our game loop, the next thing we need to do is we need to tell Kontra to go ahead and start our game loop, so that way it starts invoking our functions. So when we call the GameLoop function, it goes ahead and returns an object to us, which we're storing in our loop variable here. So this object that's returned to us will have a method called start that we can go ahead and call. So we'll do loop.start. We'll go ahead and save, and you'll see right away we start getting a bunch of console logs. So our game loop starts, and you'll see we automatically call update, then render, and then Kontra is doing this for every frame of our game. So you see this will just keep going on and on and on. So what I'm going to do really quick is I'm just going to go ahead and comment out those 2 console logs. I'm going to go ahead and refresh our page. All right, so now that we have our game loop working, the next thing we can do is we can start working on rendering out our sprites to our game. So Kontra has 2 different types of sprites available to you. The first is just a basic sprite where we draw basic shapes to our game using the canvas context and the methods that are available. So we can draw things like rectangles and circles. The other one is we can draw images. So these sprites will require an image asset, and then we can go ahead and render out that image to our canvas. So the first we're going to focus on is just creating a basic sprite. So to create a sprite, what we need to do is we need to get a reference to sprite from our global Kontra object. So we're just going to go ahead and grab sprite from Kontra. And then what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and come here, and we'll go ahead and create our sprite. So I'm just going to do const sprite, and we'll set it equal to sprite. So when we call sprite, this is expecting a configuration object that has the properties for our sprite. So the first 2 properties that we need are going to be our x and y values. So this is where it's going to render our sprite onto our canvas element. So for x, I'm going to go ahead and set that to 200, and for our y value, I'll also go ahead and set that to 200. Next, we can go ahead and specify the color property, so what color we'd like our sprite to have. So I'm just going to go ahead and do color, and I'm just going to go ahead and do blue. So next we need to specify the width and height of our sprite. So by default, Kontra, when you do a generic sprite like this, it's going to render out a rectangle. So what we'll do is we'll do width, and we're just going to go ahead and set it equal to 50. And for my height, we'll just go ahead and set it equal to 20. And then what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and add a console log, and let's go ahead and take a look at our sprite variable. So we'll go ahead and save, and we take a look at our console. We'll see where our sprite object gets logged to our console. So you'll see it has things like our position that we specified, and then things like our width and height, if it has any acceleration, its color, and then the context for our canvas. So now that we created our sprite, we actually need to tell Kontra to go ahead and render it to our screen. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to call sprite.render. So if we go ahead and save and refresh, we're going to see a really odd behavior. We see our rectangle briefly flash on our screen and then disappear. And what's happening here is this is because of our render game loop. So as I mentioned before, our game loop, basically in the render, it expects to re-render out all of our game objects, and then that's how we can show things like animation and stuff on our screen. So even though our object's not moving or anything, Kontra still expects our game object to be rendered, so that way it stays in our game. Otherwise, Kontra will go ahead and stop. Otherwise, Kontra will not render out that object for us. So to fix this, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and take our sprite, and we need to go ahead and render it inside our render function here that's invoked. So now if we save, we'll see our object shows up on our canvas element, and it stays there. So our rectangle is not very exciting because it's just stationary sitting here on our screen. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and animate our object to have it. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and animate our sprite and have it move across our screen. So one way to do this is when we create our sprite game object, we can pass additional properties for change in x and change in y to have our sprite automatically move in a certain direction for us. And one of these is dx. And what this property does is it tells Kontra to move our game object 2 pixels across our x-axis. So what that basically means is as our game updates, our game object will go ahead and move 2 pixels to the right of our screen. So you see we added our property, but nothing's happening to our game object. And the reason for that is because we didn't actually do anything in our update method. So as I mentioned before, our update method is used for when we need to actually update our game objects. So to do this, we just need to do Sprite, and we need to call the update method on our Sprite game object. And so now you'll see our game object starts moving across our screen until it reaches the end of our canvas element, and it just keeps moving in that direction. So one quick fix for this is we can check our game object where it is on our canvas, and once it gets past a certain point, we can reset its X position. So to do that, let's go ahead and do an if statement, and we'll just do if sprite.x is greater than our canvas.width. Then what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and update our X property to be equal to minus our sprite width. So basically what we're doing is once our sprite reaches the end of our canvas element here, we reset its position to be minus the width, so that way it looks like it's appearing from off the screen, and we get this nice little wrap here. So now that we know how to render basic sprites to our game, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and work on rendering out an image sprite to our game. So rendering out an image sprite is very similar to rendering out just a basic rectangle. The main difference is when we call our sprite function here and we pass our configuration, we need to specify a new property, and this property is image. And this property is expecting an HTML image element. So there are a variety of ways we can do this. So the way we're going to do this in our code is we're going to go ahead and create this element programmatically. We're going to go ahead and create a new variable. I'm just going to call this block image. And we're going to go ahead and set this equal to new image. And we'll see from our IntelliSense that new image is going to return our HTML image element. So now we have our HTML image element. We need to go ahead and specify our source attribute, so that way we can load in our actual image we want to use. So we're going to go ahead and do block image, and we'll go ahead and do source, and we're going to go ahead and set it equal to, we'll go ahead and do a string, and let's go ahead and just minimize this really quick. Let's come over to our files. We have our assets and images, and what we'll do is we'll do bean blue. So we'll go ahead and do assets. So this is going to be the relative path to where our file is from our index.html page. So that's important to note, because if we reference it relative to our JavaScript file, our browser won't be able to load the file because it will be looking in the wrong spot. So we'll do assets, and we'll do images, and we'll go ahead and do bean blue.png. So then after we update our source attribute, what we need to do is we need to come down to image, and we need to go ahead and set this to our block image. Then what we're going to do is let's go ahead and get rid of our width and height. And the reason we're doing that is by default, when Kontra creates an image sprite, it goes ahead and sets the width and height to the width and height of the image asset that was loaded. So we don't need to provide that. Next, we'll go ahead and get rid of our color attribute. Since we're not doing a rectangle, we're just doing our image. So then we have our X and Y position we'll leave, and we'll go ahead and just leave our DX property as well, so our image will move. All right, so if we save, when our browser refreshes, we'll see nothing's being rendered to our screen. So what's happening here is our browser needs to go ahead and load in our image asset. And since it's loading an asset, this takes time, and so at the time of when our code runs, we're setting our sprite to this block image, which is just an empty HTML image element, so nothing's being rendered to our screen. So if we go ahead and manually refresh our page, we should see our image pop up on our screen here. And the reason for that is because now our image is cached. It's able to have that available from our server. However, this isn't what we want when we're actually having players play our game, because it's going to appear broken. Instead, the correct thing to do is we actually need to wait for our image to load and then create our sprite game object. So luckily, this is actually really easy to do, and what we can do is we'll do block image. We can go ahead and use our onLoad property of our object here. And what this property expects is it expects a function, and this function will go ahead and be called once our image is fully loaded, and then this is where we can actually create our sprite game object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of this code, and I'm just going to go ahead and place it into this onload statement here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save and refresh. All right, and we'll see an error, Sprite is not defined. Yes, because we created our Sprite variable inside this function here, its scope is contained to this function. So what I'm going to do is, just as a quick fix, we're going to do let Sprite equal null. And then what we'll do is down here, instead of creating our const variable, we'll just go ahead and reference Sprite. So that way our variable now will be a Sprite object when this runs. And then what we need to do is we should come down to our update method, and let's go ahead and add a check to see if our Sprite object exists. And we'll go ahead and copy these lines of code and place it here. Go ahead and get rid of all this. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing here. So if Sprite, we'll go ahead and render it. So that way, when our game loop starts, if our asset has not been loaded yet, we won't be throwing errors. So now if we go ahead and take a look at our page, you'll see that we have our image being rendered to our canvas, and we'll see that it's animating just like our other sprite was before. All right, so next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and work on interacting with our game objects in our game. So for our game, we're going to be allowing players to go ahead and click on our game objects, and we're going to have our game react accordingly. So to handle interactions in Kontra, we need to go ahead and use our pointer API in order to make our game objects interactive. So to go ahead and work with the pointer API, we need to go ahead and use the init pointer property from our global Kontra object. So what we'll do is in our const at the top of our file, we'll go ahead and do init pointer. And to go ahead and use this API, the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and call this method. So what we'll do is after we initialize our canvas, we'll go ahead and call init pointer. And basically what this function does is it tells Kontra that we're going to be expecting interactions with our game. If you don't call this method, we won't be able to work with any of the pointer functions so that we can interact with our game objects. So after we call our init pointer function, the next thing we need to do is we actually need to add some new properties to our game object. And so these properties are going to be functions that will be called when we interact with our game object in various ways. So some of the ways we can interact with this, we can do on mouse down. So when we click on our game object, we can do on up. When our mouse click comes up from our game object, we can handle events that way. And we can also handle on over. So like when we're hovering over our game objects, we can listen for that event as well. So for these properties, they are called on down, on up, and on over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add the on down property. And these properties are going to be expecting a function. And basically what will happen is Kontra, when our mouse interacts with our game, when these particular events happen, this function will be called. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a console log. And I'm just going to go ahead and put on down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this statement. I'm going to paste it 2 more times. And I'm just going to do on up. And I'm going to go ahead and do on over. And I'm going to go ahead and update our console log so that we have the appropriate values. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and comment out our code for moving our sprite. And then I'm going to go ahead and come up to our DX property. I'm going to comment that out as well, so that way our sprite will be stationary for us. So then if I go ahead and clear out our console, you'll see when I try to interact with my game object, nothing's happening. And the reason for that is Kontra is expecting us to tell the pointer API which game objects it needs to track for these interactions. So to do that, we need to go ahead and get a reference to the track property. And then what we'll do is after we create our sprite object here, we need to go ahead and use that function to tell Kontra to go ahead and track this game object. So we'll go ahead and do sprite, and we'll go ahead and save. So now, if we go ahead and clear our console, you'll see when I hover over our game object, our on over event is invoked. If I click on it, you'll see that we have our on down and our on up functions being called as well.